Why was it always her? That question sat heavy in her chest as the rain hammered against her helmet, each drop a drumbeat of doubt. Orders had been clear: hold the bridge until reinforcements arrived. 10 minutes, that was all they'd asked. 10 minutes, no more. Yet even as the command crackled through the broken radio, Elena Cross knew 10 minutes meant nothing. Reinforcements weren't coming. Not tonight, not in this storm. And if the bridge fell, so would everyone behind her. The river below boiled like an unleashed beast, swollen from 3 days of rain, its roar almost drowning the sounds of war. The stone arches shook under the weight of water and fear. Somewhere beyond the tree line, enemy rifles waited. Somewhere out there in the dark, men whispered in a language she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. And somewhere behind her, across the valley, dozens of soldiers clung to hope she could not betray. She pulled her braid tighter beneath the rim of her helmet, adjusted her rifle against her shoulder, and looked at the squad huddled with her. 9 faces, mud-streaked, exhausted, eyes wide with the knowledge that they were pawns in someone else's impossible plan. Some were barely more than boys, their hands trembling as they loaded magazines. Others stared blankly, already past fear, clinging only to duty. All of them, without meaning to, turned toward her. Elena wasn't their highest-ranking officer. She wasn't the strongest. But there was something in the way she stood, calm in the chaos, her voice never rising, her breathing steady. It made them straighten, even as fear threatened to pull them apart. Still she felt it, the silence between the thunderclaps, the unspoken question in their eyes: will you hold, can we? Her stomach nodded, but she gave them what they needed: certainty. We hold, she said quietly. The first attack came without warning. Muzzle flashes split the darkness, lightning made a fire. Bullets screamed across the river, shattering stone and spraying chips into the night. The squad opened up in return, rifles spitting tracers that carved red arcs against the black sky. Elena braced herself, squeezed the trigger, and let the rifle become an extension of her breath. 2 enemies fell, their bodies tumbling into the current. 4 more went silent, swallowed by the roar of the river. For a moment it almost felt manageable. For a moment the bridge still belonged to them. Then the mortars came. The first shell exploded short, a geyser of mud and water drenching their sandbag line. The second landed true, fire and stone, screams torn from throats that would never scream again. 2 soldiers vanished into the torrent below before anyone could even call their names. Elena threw herself flat, her ears ringing, the taste of grit thick on her tongue. She forced herself up, dragging a bleeding private by his vest, shoving him behind the last shreds of cover. Her hands shook, just for half a second, only half. Then the tremor was gone, buried beneath years of training. She pressed a hand to the private's wound, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. By 200, 4 were gone. By 300, 3 more were too broken to fight. The radio sputtered, its voice cold and hollow. Negative, hold position. Reinforcements delayed. That word delayed cut deeper than shrapnel. Delayed meant abandoned. Delayed meant you are alone. By 400, only she and Corporal Mason still returned fire. Mason's face was pale beneath streaks of blood, his left arm bound with a ragged bandage that soaked through in minutes. But his machine gun roared on, each burst defiance carved into the storm. "Lieutenant," he rasped between coughs, spitting red into the mud. "They're not coming, you know that. We should blow the bridge, cut our losses." Elena's eyes flicked to the charges wired along the stone. She knew he was right. One push of a button would deny the enemy this crossing, but it would also condemn every friendly unit still retreating through the valley. Soldiers running on fumes, praying for this bridge to hold. If she destroyed it now, they would die on the wrong side of the river, trapped. She forced her voice steady, even as thunder shook the valley. "No, we hold." Mason gave a bitter laugh that ended in another cough. "You always were too damn stubborn." At 4:30, the night erupted again. This time, shadows poured from the tree line in numbers that made her heart stutter. Dozens, maybe more, charging with rifles blazing, grenades arcing in wild, desperate throws. Mason's gun spat until it clicked dry. He fought to reload, but his hand slipped, blood soaking everything. He managed half a belt before another wave of rounds cut him down. His body slumped sideways, silent. And then there was only Elena. Alone. She checked her last magazine. 30 rounds, 30 breaths of borrowed time, 30 thin strands between survival and annihilation. She slid the mag into place, racked the bolt, and planted herself at the bridge's center. Rain dripped from her helmet. Her heartbeat steadied even as her hands clenched the grip. She didn't think about medals. She didn't think about orders. She thought of the men behind her, still running, still fighting for a chance to live. She thought of Mason, of his bitter laugh. She thought of the faces of soldiers she'd never meet, soldiers who needed this bridge. She whispered words older than her uniform, words her grandfather had once murmured after nights of silence and loss. The only easy day was yesterday. Then she pulled the trigger. The river answered with echoes of thunder. Enemy rifles lit the night, their shadows rushing forward with boots slapping against the mud. Elena's breathing slowed, her body moving with machine precision. One dropped, then another, adjust for wind, adjust for rain. Her rifle sang in short, deliberate bursts, but the numbers didn't stop. For every figure that fell, 3 more filled the gap. Her weapon clicked empty. She exhaled, calm even as fear clawed at the edges. Kneeling in the mud, she reached for Mason's weapon, fingers brushing against blood still warm. The machine gun roared again, drowning out the storm, tracers cutting swaths through the charging line. Enemy bodies scattered, their momentum blunted, but never broken. Her muscles ached, her lungs screamed. Yet she kept firing, kept holding, because falling wasn't an option, not yet. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered the question she had buried for hours. How long can one person hold the world on her shoulders? She didn't answer, she just kept firing. What does silence sound like when even your own heart doesn't want to break it? For Elena Cross, it sounded like the click of an empty chamber, the rain tapping against metal, and the quiet realization that she was the last one standing. Mason's body slumped beside her, his machine gun still warm from the last belt he'd fired. She forced her trembling fingers around the grip, dragged it into position, and pulled the trigger. The roar that followed felt unnatural, like the weapon was bellowing against death itself. The tracers carved fire across the darkness, cutting down shadows that seemed endless. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, the charge slowed. But then the belt ran dry. Elena's breaths came ragged now. She tasted blood in her mouth, whether hers or Mason's she couldn't tell. The bridge smelled of cordite, mud, and the copper sting of spilled lives. Somewhere behind her, through the sheets of rain, she thought she could hear distant boots, their own soldiers still retreating, still depending on her. She dug into Mason's pack, ripping it open with trembling hands until she found it. One last belt, one last scream of defiance. She loaded, slammed the cover shut, and opened fire again. Hours blurred into something shapeless. She didn't know when night ended, only that the rain never stopped. At times, exhaustion tried to drag her into the mud. Her vision blurred. Her arms felt like lead. But every time her body begged for surrender, her mind returned to the same thought. They're still running, still crossing, still alive because you haven't fallen. That thought was fire, stronger than fatigue, louder than fear. At some point, smoke rolled across the bridge, grenades hissing, turning the world into a suffocating haze. Her instincts screamed, they're in it, they're coming now. She fired blind, bursts into the gray curtain. Muffled cries answered her, bodies thudding against stone. When the smoke cleared, 5 lay scattered at her boots. She barely glanced at them. There was no time. A crack split the storm, a sniper. The bullet snapped past her helmet, ricocheting into the stone. She dropped, breath locked in her throat, eyes scanning. Then she saw it, a faint glint barely visible through the rain. She exhaled, slow, steadied, and fired. The figure toppled, rifle tumbling into the abyss below. The radio hissed suddenly. Static at first, then a fractured voice. Charlie base to Cross. Status, hold. Elena snatched it, pressed down with a muddy thumb. Still holding. Bridge intact. Reinforcements Ada. Silence, then, delayed 20 more minutes, can you? The rest drowned in static. 20 more minutes, she almost laughed. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 years. She looked at her ammo. Mason's belt half gone, her rifle dry, her pistol still full but only one magazine. And the enemy, their voices grew louder, their boots heavier, their shouts sharper. They were preparing. And then she saw them. From the tree line, armored shapes lumbered forward. Not shadows this time, but hulking iron beasts. Their engines growled like predators, headlights slicing through the rain. Armored vehicles moving to crush her last defense. Her pulse hammered. Her eyes flicked to the charges set along the stone. Her thumb brushed the detonator. One press and the bridge would vanish in fire and rubble. The vehicles would never cross, but neither would the soldiers still retreating. Men and women who had counted on this one bridge to make it back alive. She froze, the detonator heavy in her palm. If she pressed it, she'd save herself the agony of what came next, but she'd also damn her brothers and sisters. Her jaw clenched. "Damn it," she hissed and hurled the detonator aside. She wasn't here to save herself. The vehicles advanced, engines rumbling like the sky itself. She sprinted back to Mason's gun, yanked the trigger, and the weapon roared again. Sparks danced across steel. One vehicle swerved, its tire shredded. Another caught fire, rolling back into the tree line in flames. But the third pressed on, unshaken, its turret swinging toward her. Elena's body screamed at her to dive, to run, to hide. But she didn't move. She stood tall, rain streaming down her face, defiance burning in her eyes. If this was the end, she would meet it on her feet. The vehicle's gun thundered. And then an explosion ripped through the tree line. Fire blossomed where the armored column had been. Then another. The sky lit with chaos as someone struck the enemy from behind. Elena blinked against the rain, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Was it their own forces, a hidden ally, or had fate itself decided she had stood long enough? She didn't know, and in that moment it didn't matter. The vehicles burned. Black smoke coiled into the storm. The enemy formation faltered, shouts twisting into panic. For a heartbeat it seemed as if the tide had shifted, but no reinforcements appeared. Whoever had struck had vanished as suddenly as they came. She was still alone. Her machine gun was scorched, barrel glowing from the relentless fire. Her rifle lay empty. Her sidearm felt like a child's toy in her hand, 15 rounds, maybe less. 15 against dozens. She tightened her grip. 15 is enough. By 600, whistles cut through the rain. Another wave surged from the tree line, not cautious squads this time, but desperate men with wild eyes and raw throats. They weren't fighting to advance anymore. They were fighting to end her, to trample her into the mud, to claim the bridge no matter the cost. Elena braced at the center of the broken structure. Her pistol rose, steady despite the tremor in her arm. The first shot rang, one figure dropped, the second, the third. Her breath timed each squeeze, each fall, but then the slide locked back, empty. 15 rounds gone, 15 bodies silenced, dozens still came. She dropped the pistol, drew her combat knife, the steel glinting under the lightning. Her muscles screamed. Her shoulder throbbed with the memory of shrapnel, but she planted her boots in the mud and refused to move. The first soldier lunged, rifle swinging like a club. She ducked, drove the knife into his side, twisted, shoved him into the river. Another charged with a bayonet. She sidestepped, caught his arm, snapped it against the stone, hurled him down. Her breath came ragged now, each exhale mixing with rain and blood. This was no longer a fight for ground. This was a fight against exhaustion, against darkness, against the voice inside that begged her to just let go. "One more minute," she whispered to herself, "just one more." Blood slicked the stones. Thunder shook the valley. She lost count of how many came, only that each fall meant another step survived. Her arms grew heavy, her knife coated crimson, but still she stood. Then he appeared. a shadow larger than the rest. An enemy officer, armored, shoulders broad, wielding a warhammer that looked ripped from some nightmare. He barreled toward her, weapon raised. The hammer swung. She barely raised her arm in time. The impact cracked against her forearm, white-hot pain ripping through her. She crashed to her knees, the knife slipping. The officer raised the hammer again. And in that moment, Mason's voice echoed in her memory. "You always were too damn stubborn." Her eyes narrowed. Her free hand darted to a broken rifle on the ground, not to fire but to fight. As the hammer descended, she thrust the barrel upward, deflecting the blow. Sparks flew as steel clashed against steel. With a final surge, she drove her knife into his thigh and shoved with every ounce of strength left. The officer fell, swallowed by the wave behind him. The enemy faltered, stunned. And then the sound of rotors cut through the storm. Elena lifted her eyes, rain streaming down her face. Shadows emerged from the gray sky, helicopters, their searchlights slicing the dawn, their guns roaring. Reinforcements at last. The enemy broke. Chaos rippled through their lines. Survivors fled into the tree line, abandoning weapons, abandoning their dead. The bridge remained. Elena dropped to her knees, knife slipping from numb fingers. She couldn't even hear her own breath over the thunder of rotors. Soldiers poured across the bridge behind her, boots pounding, voices shouting. But they sounded distant, blurred, like echoes in a dream. The bridge still stood. And so did she. What do you feel when the storm finally breaks? Relief, or the weight of everything you carried just to get there? Elena didn't feel relief. Not at first. She felt the silence. The sudden absence of gunfire after 7 hours of hell. The silence of rain tapping stone instead of bullets cracking air. The silence of bodies no longer charging. She sat slumped against the parapet, mud clinging to her armor, the knife slipping from her hand as her body surrendered to gravity. Around her, the bridge looked less like stone and more like the bones of something ancient, scarred, cracked, soaked in blood. Hands found her shoulders, dragging her upright. Voices cut through the haze, sharp but distant. "Lieutenant, medic, over here." Boots pounded across the bridge, Marines storming past her, weapons raised, securing the last scattered pockets of resistance. Helicopter rotors churned the air, spotlights sweeping the tree line. Smoke still curled from burning vehicles, flames licking skyward. Someone pressed gauze against her ribs. Another tightened a bandage around her arm. Elena blinked against the blinding light, vision swimming in and out. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled. Then her voice cracked free, hoarse, fragile. "Did they make it across?" The medic froze. "What?" Her eyes locked on his, steel gray but dim with exhaustion. "The others, did they make it across?" He hesitated, then nodded. "They did because of you." Her head fell back against the stone. For the first time since midnight, her chest loosened. The air she exhaled carried more weight than the storm itself. Yes, they made it. That was all that mattered. When command arrived minutes later, the bridge was already reinforced. Marines lined the banks, engineers checking the structure. Enemy survivors scattered into the tree line, their strength broken. Elena, barely conscious, was lifted onto a stretcher. The world tilted as they carried her toward the waiting bird, her blood smearing the fabric, her boots dragging through the mud. A corporal caught her hand when she tried to sit up. "You've done enough, Lieutenant, more than anyone had a right to ask." But Elena shook her head weakly. "Not enough, not until every one of ours safe." Even broken, she couldn't surrender. Her voice was little more than a whisper now, but it carried something the storm couldn't drown: will. The helicopter roared to life, lifting her above the valley. From the open door she saw it one last time, the bridge battered but unbroken. Mason's machine gun lay in the mud where she'd left it, its barrel scorched black. The bodies of her squad scattered like stones in the current, silent testimony to the price they'd paid. Her throat tightened. For a moment she wanted to cry, but no tears came, only silence. The report came later, official sterile, words stripped of blood and rain. Lieutenant Elena Cross held Bridge Point Alpha against overwhelming enemy assault for approximately 7 hours. Enemy casualties, 112 confirmed, 40 plus unconfirmed. Friendly casualties, 9 KIA, 1 WIA. Bridge remained intact. Reinforcements arrived at 6:35 local. That was all the paperwork said. Numbers times outcomes. But numbers don't remember screams in the dark. Numbers don't hear Mason's last laugh, or the wet cough of a dying private whispering for his mother. Numbers don't carry the image of a woman standing alone at the center of a bridge, a pistol in her hand, a knife in her grip, her body refusing to fall even as everything else collapsed. The soldiers who crossed that bridge remembered differently. They remembered the silhouette in the rain, unmoving, unbroken. They remembered tracer fire cutting the storm, grenades exploding against stone, and one figure that refused to retreat. They remembered how she fought with rifle, with machine gun, with pistol, with knife, and when none of that remained, with her bare hands. And when the whispers spread, they carried her name. Cross's Bridge, they began to call it. A place not marked on any map, not in any textbook, but burned into the marrow of those who lived. Days blurred into weeks in the hospital. Elena lay beneath sterile lights, her arm in a cast, ribs wrapped tight, IV tubes dripping quietly. Nurses moved like shadows. The hallways smelled of disinfectant instead of mud and cordite. She hated it. She hated the quiet most of all. The silence here didn't feel like survival. It felt like emptiness. When her commanding officer walked in, she sat straighter without thinking. Muscle memory, habit. He carried a file in one hand, his jaw set with something heavy. "Lieutenant Cross," he said softly, "do you know what they're calling you?" She shook her head. Her braid was gone, shorn short for the medics. Scars ran across her knuckles. Her hands trembled without permission. "The last one standing." She looked down at those hands, scarred, fragile, shaking. Titles didn't matter, they never had. She hadn't fought for a name. She hadn't fought for recognition. She fought because no one else could. Because if she hadn't, dozens wouldn't have made it home. The officer set a small box on the bed. She knew what it was before he even opened it. The metal inside gleamed, heavy, unnecessary. She stared at it for a long time, then closed the lid. "I don't need a medal," she said quietly. Her voice was steady now, even as her body was. "I just need to know the bridge is still there." His reply was simple. "It is because of you." Nights were the hardest. When the hospital fell quiet, when the halls dimmed, when there was no thunder to drown the memories. She would lie awake, hearing the rain that wasn't falling, smelling the smoke that wasn't there. She would close her eyes and feel the weight of the detonator in her hand, hear Mason's laugh, see the officer's hammer swinging down. She would hear her own whisper, "One more minute," and wonder how many more she could have endured before breaking. Sometimes she thought she hadn't survived. Not really, only her body had. And yet she never regretted it. She'd chosen the harder path every time. When Mason told her to blow the bridge, when the detonator lay heavy in her palm, when the pistol ran dry and the knife was all that remained. She had chosen not to fall. And because of that choice, others had lived. That thought steadied her hands when nothing else did. Weeks later, when she was finally strong enough to walk, she returned. The sun was out this time, bright and almost mocking. The river had calmed, its roar softened to a whisper. The bridge still stood, scarred and battered but unbroken. Bullet holes pocked the stone. Scorch marks blackened its arches, but it remained. She walked to the center, stopped where Mason had fallen, where she had stood with a pistol against the world. She placed her hand against the stone, closed her eyes. The echoes returned, gunfire, screams, rotor blades, Mason's last words. But above it all, one sound lingered. Silence. The silence of survival. She whispered into the current below, soft enough that only the river would hear. "You carried them home. That's all that matters." And without waiting for an answer, she turned away. In years to come, cadets at the academy would study maps of that battle. Instructors would lecture about choke points, attrition, the mathematics of defense. But the soldiers never spoke of numbers. They spoke of her, of Elena Cross, the woman who was ordered to hold the bridge and who did, alone, until history could no longer ignore her. Because sometimes legends aren't born, they're forged, forged in rain and fire, forged when one soldier decides the line will not break, not here, not now, not while she still stands. And when the medals tarnished and the files yellowed, the whispers remained. "Remember the bridge," they said. "Remember Cross's bridge." Because it wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It was proof. Proof that courage can outlast fear. Proof that sometimes one person really can hold the line for everyone else. How do you live with silence when the world insists on filling it with voices you don't recognize? For Elena, the silence of the hospital had been unbearable, but the noise that followed her recovery was worse. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. Soldiers straightened when she passed as though her presence carried gravity. Nurses spoke softer when tending to her, as if afraid to break some fragile spell. Letters arrived by the dozens, names she didn't know, words like hero, legend, guardian. They spoke of her as if she were more than flesh and bone, more than a soldier who had simply refused to move. But inside, she didn't feel like a legend. She felt like a survivor, and survival, she had learned, was its own punishment. At night, when the lights dimmed and the halls quieted, she felt it again, the weight of the bridge pressing against her chest. Not stone, not water, but memory. Mason's laugh echoing, the static of the radio whispering delayed, the cold of a detonator she hadn't pressed. She would see faces of the 9 who never walked back across, their silhouettes burned into lightning flashes in her dreams. And she would wake with the same question burning in her mind: why me? The first time she stepped back into formation, weeks later, the air shifted. Soldiers beside her, men twice her size, glanced at her as if they were standing next to something untouchable. She caught it in their eyes: reverence, unease, gratitude. It made her uneasy. During briefings, officers would pause when addressing her, their voices tinged with something unspoken. During drills, cadets whispered her name like a secret passed down the line. Once, she overheard a private mutter, "That's her, the bridge." She wanted to tell them the truth, that she hadn't been fearless, that every second had been stitched together from desperation and stubbornness, not valor, that she had thought about pressing that detonator, that she had almost given up when Mason fell. But she never said it, because silence spoke louder than confessions. The story of Bridge Point Alpha traveled faster than she ever could, first within the battalion, then division, then across entire commands. Officers dissected the battle for strategy. Soldiers retold it for courage. And somewhere in the blur, the truth bent. In one version, she had fought for 12 hours straight without food or water. In another, she had taken down an enemy tank with a single grenade. Some swore she had killed hundreds single-handedly. Others claimed she never bled, never faltered. The myth grew taller than the woman herself. And Elena hated it. Because every exaggeration stole something real: the blood on Mason's uniform, the sound of the river carrying away bodies, the moment her pistol clicked empty and she thought it was the end. These were not the tales soldiers passed around fires. These were truths, and they were hers. But myths never cared about truth. Myths only cared about survival. Months after her recovery, she was ordered to attend a ceremony. The hall was filled with brass and banners, the kind of room where words like sacrifice and valor were polished until they shone brighter than the medals pinned to chests. Elena stood at the center, her cast removed, her uniform crisp, her scars hidden beneath fabric. A general spoke words she barely heard. Citations, honors, a list of names her squad 9 pronounced dead with formality, then her name spoken like a cornerstone. She stood straight, accepted the medal placed in her hands, heavy, cold, the same one she had already turned away once before. Applause thundered, cameras flashed, soldiers saluted. And Elena's eyes drifted to the floor, to the space between her boots. She imagined the mud again, the rain, the bodies at her feet. The applause felt hollow compared to the silence of that bridge. When it ended, she tucked the medal into her pocket and left without a word. Outside, under a pale evening sky, a young cadet intercepted her. Barely 20, his uniform too stiff, his salute trembling. His eyes shone with something she recognized, hope. "Lieutenant Cross," he said breathlessly, "Ma'am, it's an honor. I want you to know your story kept me going during training. I thought, if you could hold the line like that, maybe I could too." She studied him, the eagerness in his face, the way he clung to her silence as though it gave him permission to believe in himself. And she realized then this was why myths grew, not for the ones who lived them, for the ones who needed them. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Her scarred knuckles brushed against the fabric of his sleeve. "It wasn't strength," she said softly. "It was choice. Remember that." His smile faltered with confusion, but he nodded anyway. He wanted to believe, needed to. And she let him. The nights didn't get easier, they only changed. No longer the sterile silence of hospital rooms, no longer the applause of ceremonies. Now it was the quiet of her own barracks, where darkness pressed against her skin and memory crawled beneath it. She would sit on the edge of her bunk, fingers tracing scars on her arm, replaying the seconds she nearly pressed the detonator. She would wonder if she had been reckless or merciful, brave or foolish, a savior or simply too stubborn to surrender. No answer ever came, only silence. But in that silence a truth grew. It didn't matter what the world called her. It didn't matter if her story was twisted, bent, exaggerated. What mattered was that the bridge still stood. What mattered was that others lived. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Yet for all her silence, there was one sound she couldn't escape. The river. Whenever rain fell, no matter where she was, training grounds, barracks, cities, the sound of water against stone pulled her back to the roar beneath that bridge, back to the endless current carrying bodies into blackness, back to Mason's laugh echoing against thunder. The river was everywhere, in pipes, in drains, in gutters. And each time she closed her eyes and whispered the same words, "One more minute." Because even in peace, survival was still war. How far can a name travel before it no longer belongs to the one who carries it? Elena learned the answer in fragments. A letter from a soldier she had never met, thanking her for holding his life on that bridge. A passing remark from a civilian who had read her story in the papers. A news clip replayed on muted televisions in base cafeterias, her photograph splashed across the screen like a headline instead of a human being. Everywhere she turned, it seemed her silence had been filled by other people's voices. Cross's Bridge, they called it now. Not Bridge Point Alpha, not the tactical choke point by the river, Cross's Bridge. At first she resisted hearing it. She told herself it was just talk, soldiers finding meaning in something too brutal to face without a story attached. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. They followed her into every mess hall, every barracks, every corridor. And sometimes she caught something in those whispers that made her chest ache. Reverence, hope, belief. They needed her to be more than she was. But at night, when the silence returned, she knew the truth. She hadn't been fearless. She hadn't been unbreakable. She'd been desperate, exhausted, terrified. And she had chosen not to move. Her past crept into her thoughts more often now. Not the war, not the bridge, but the roots beneath it. Her grandfather's voice, raspy from years of smoking, whispering, "The only easy day was yesterday." She remembered the way he'd said it, not like a motto, not like a battle cry, but like a weary truth. She had been 12, sitting on the porch of a farmhouse that smelled of rain-soaked wood, listening to him talk about days he never explained in detail. Back then she hadn't understood. Now, standing in uniform, scars tugging at her skin, she did. She remembered her mother, too, gentle, stubborn in her own way. A nurse who had worked long nights and returned home with tired eyes but a smile she never failed to give her daughter. "You don't quit on people," her mother had told her once, hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic. "Not when they need you most." That voice had been with Elena on the bridge, even when the world roared against her. And Mason, though he was gone, his bitter laugh still lived in her chest. "You always were too damn stubborn." It wasn't a compliment, not really. But in the quiet, it almost felt like permission. The military wanted her face on posters, recruitment campaigns, interviews. She turned them all down, not with anger, not with defiance, just silence. She didn't want to sell war. She didn't want her scars to be polished into symbols. She wanted to breathe, without remembering blood in the rain. Still, the legend spread. Instructors at academies told cadets about the battle, sketching maps on chalkboards, drawing lines of attack and defense. They called her stand a case study in attrition warfare. They dissected it, broke it into numbers and lessons. Cadets listened with wide eyes, but the soldiers who had been there remembered differently. They didn't talk about choke points or attrition. They talked about her, about the way she had stood at the center of that bridge like it was the axis of the world, about how she hadn't left, not even when she could have. For them, it wasn't about strategy. It was about stubbornness, about sacrifice, about choosing to hold the line. Elena tried to move on. She threw herself into training, into leading, into sharpening every edge of herself until there was no space left for memory. But no matter how far she ran, the bridge stayed with her. Sometimes, in the middle of drills, she would feel the phantom weight of Mason's machine gun in her hands. Sometimes, the sound of rain on the roof of a barracks would pull her back to the river, to that endless current swallowing voices. And always, always the question returned, why me? She had no answer, only silence. One evening, months after the battle, she sat alone in the barracks. The others had gone to the mess hall, laughter faint through the walls. She stayed behind, her body aching from training, her hands restless. She opened the small box she had kept tucked away since the ceremony. The medal still lay inside, gleaming in the dim light, untouched. She stared at it for a long time, not with pride, not with bitterness, just distance. What did it mean? That she had survived when others hadn't, that she had stood where Mason fell, that she had chosen not to press a button and doom her own. It felt less like an honor and more like a reminder. She closed the box again and whispered into the dark, "I didn't do it for this." There were times she thought about leaving, about walking away from uniforms, from duty, from a world that insisted on turning her into something she was. She imagined a quiet life somewhere far from rivers and bridges. Maybe the farmhouse, maybe her mother's town, maybe someplace nameless. But then she would remember the faces of those who had crossed because she hadn't given up. She would remember the cadet outside the ceremony, clinging to her silence as though it meant he could be strong too. And she would stay. Not because she wanted to, but because someone had to. The legend of Cross's Bridge didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the ones who told it, to the cadets who needed it to believe in their own survival, to the soldiers who whispered it on long marches to remind themselves that impossible things were sometimes possible. For them, it wasn't about Elena Cross the woman. It was about the idea of her. And she let them have it. Because if the price of their hope was her silence, she would pay it. But deep down, when the nights pressed heavy and the river roared in her ears, she knew the truth. She hadn't been fearless. She hadn't been invincible. She had been tired, broken, afraid. And she had chosen to stand anyway. That, she decided, was enough. Because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to face it. Sometimes with a rifle, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with nothing but stubbornness, and sometimes with silence. How long can you carry a story before it starts carrying you? Years passed, but the bridge never left her. Elena Cross returned to duty, though not the front line. Her injuries made sure of that. The fractures in her ribs had healed, the cast was long gone, but her body still bore reminders. Her left arm ached in the cold. Her right knee stiffened on long marches. Scars mapped her skin, invisible under the uniform but always there in the quiet. She was reassigned to training. An instructor now, not a fighter. A voice, not a rifle. Some called it a demotion. Others called it an honor. She called it survival. The first day she walked into the training yard, cadets snapped to attention so sharply it echoed. Their eyes locked on her, wide, almost reverent. She hated it. Not their respect, no, that was earned. She hated the pedestal. They whispered her name like a spell. Cross, the bridge, the last one standing. To them she was Elena. She was the story they'd been told. She cleared her throat, studied their ranks, and spoke simply. You've heard the stories, forget them. Stories won't save you, choices will. Some nodded, unsure. Others stole glances at one another, confusion etched across their faces. They wanted her to be larger than life, but she refused. Training them was harder than fighting. Not because of the drills or the hours or the endless mistakes young soldiers made, but because every time one faltered, she saw Mason. Every time one struggled to hold their rifle steady, she remembered the private she had dragged across the bridge. Every laugh, every curse, every stumble pulled her back into echoes she couldn't silence. And yet she trained them, patiently, relentlessly. Because she knew what waited beyond the safety of this yard. She knew what war demanded, and she knew they needed more than stories to face it. So she gave them the truth. She taught them how fear would creep into their lungs, how exhaustion would whisper for them to lie down and let go, how the moment would come when everything inside screamed surrender, and the only thing left would be choice. Courage, she told them, isn't fire in your chest. It's ashes, heavy, silent, and it only matters if you keep walking with it. Some understood. Others just wrote it down in notebooks, unsure if it meant anything yet. But one day they would. Her name followed her even when she didn't speak. At briefings, commanders introduced her with gravity. Lieutenant Elena Cross, hero of Bridge Point Alpha. At ceremonies, they read her citations before she could slip away. At gatherings, soldiers sought her out, asking questions they thought were harmless. What did it feel like standing alone? Were you afraid? Did you know you were making history? She always answered with the same silence, sometimes with a small nod, sometimes with the faintest smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because how could she explain? How could she tell them about the mud in her teeth, the weight of Mason's gun, the moment she almost pressed the detonator and ended everything? How could she tell them that history hadn't felt like history at all, that it had just felt like rain and terror and 1 minute stretching into eternity? No, silence was easier. But silence had its price. At night, when the cadets slept and the base fell quiet, she would walk the perimeter alone. The moonlight reminded her of flares. The gravel under her boots reminded her of the bridge's stone. The wind through the trees carried whispers she tried not to hear. Sometimes she stopped and pressed her palm to the chain-link fence, as though trying to steady herself against ghosts. She knew she was supposed to feel proud. That's what everyone wanted from her. Pride, gratitude, maybe even peace. But all she felt was tired. Not broken, not defeated, just tired. As though she had been carrying the weight of that bridge for too long, and no matter how many years passed, it never grew lighter. The cadets adored her. They watched her with eyes hungry for lessons. They studied her movements, her words, even her silence. To them, she wasn't just a soldier. She was proof. proof that one person could stand against impossible odds, proof that courage was real, proof that survival meant something. One cadet, a young woman named Riley, followed her more closely than the rest. Bright-eyed, stubborn, always volunteering for the hardest drills. One evening, after the others had gone, Riley lingered. "Lieutenant Cross," she asked quietly. Elena turned, her expression unreadable. "Yes." "Why didn't you press the detonator?" The question struck harder than any mortar. For a moment, Elena froze, caught between memory and silence. The detonator's weight returned to her hand. The river's roar surged in her ears. Mason's voice echoed. She could have lied, could have said she knew reinforcements would come, could have said she trusted her orders, could have said anything that sounded like courage. Instead, she met Riley's gaze, because they weren't across yet. Riley frowned. "You risked yourself for them." "No," Elena said softly. "I risked the bridge. There's a difference." The cadet didn't understand, not fully, not yet, but one day she would. Years carved themselves into Elena's face, though she was still young by the measure of life. Lines etched from sleepless nights, shadows beneath her eyes that never faded, scars across her arm that no fabric could completely hide. But her voice grew steadier, her silence grew heavier. When she spoke, cadets leaned in. When she walked, soldiers stood straighter. She didn't want it, but she carried it. Because sometimes, survival means carrying more than your own weight. And still, in the deepest quiet, the river followed her. She heard it in rainfall, in drains, in the rush of showers against tile. She heard it even in silence, like a ghost humming in her ears. The river reminded her of everything she had lost, but it also reminded her of why she had stood. Not for medals, not for recognition, not for history. For them, the ones who had crossed, the ones who had lived. And maybe, just maybe, for the cadets who looked at her now, eyes wide, hearts untested. Because one day they would face their own bridges, and they would have to decide whether to stand. Elena Cross was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a survivor. She was a story, a symbol, a silence that others filled with their own meaning. And she carried it, heavy, unasked for but unbroken. Because sometimes the greatest burden isn't what you live through. It's what people believe you are after. How long does a legend live before it fades into silence? For Elena Cross, the answer was complicated. The world moved on, wars shifted, new names filled headlines, new battles redrew maps, fresh scars replaced old ones. For the public, her story became a page in dusty archives, a paragraph in a history book few bothered to read. Civilians forgot, politicians forgot, even commanders over time spoke her name less. But among soldiers, her story never disappeared. In barracks at midnight, when exhaustion pressed heavy and silence grew unbearable, someone always whispered it. The bridge, the rain, the lone lieutenant who refused to fall. New recruits, too young to have lived it, repeated it as though they had been there. Seasoned veterans nodded quietly, carrying the memory like a talisman. Cross's Bridge. It was no longer just a battle. It was a reminder that sometimes when everything collapses, one person can still choose to stand. Elena herself had no desire to keep the memory alive. Years had weathered her. Her hair had grayed at the edges. Her scars had stiffened into aches that never left. She still trained, still walked the yards with a presence that made cadets fall silent, but her body no longer belonged to war. She lived quietly, a shadow within the very system that had once used her as a banner. She avoided ceremonies, declined interviews, let the noise fade without chasing it. In the evenings, she sat alone in her quarters, sometimes with tea cooling in her hand, sometimes with nothing but silence for company. The medal, still locked in its box, lay at the back of a drawer. She had never displayed it, never polished it, never even touched it after that night. What mattered was not the medal. What mattered was the bridge still standing. Yet every so often, the past reached her. A knock at her door. A young soldier hesitant, holding a letter from a family she had never met. "Thank you for saving my father. Thank you for bringing my brother home." Sometimes a cadet lingered after training, eyes wide with questions they were too afraid to ask aloud. And in their silence, she saw the same question again and again. How? She never gave them easy answers. It wasn't strength, she would say. It was choice, and it hurt. They didn't always understand, but they always remembered. There was a day, long after she had retired from official service, when she returned to the valley. The sun was out this time, the river calm beneath a blue sky. She walked slowly, her steps careful, a cane steadying her gait. The bridge was still there, scarred with bullet holes, scorched from fire but whole. She paused at the center, her hand resting against the stone, and closed her eyes. The roar of memory rose up instantly. The shouts, the rain, Mason's bitter laugh, the gunfire, the detonator heavy in her palm. It was all still there. But so was the silence that followed, the silence of survival. She whispered, barely audible, "One more minute." And then she let the silence carry it away. When she left, she didn't look back. The bridge no longer belonged to her. It never had. It belonged to those who crossed, to those who lived, to those who whispered its story long after the world forgot. Instructors still used her battle in classrooms, maps drawn on boards, chalk lines for enemy advances, circles for defensive points. They called it a lesson in choke points, attrition, resilience. But when the lectures ended, when cadets packed their bags, the story they carried was different. They didn't remember chalk lines. They remembered her name. They remembered Elena Cross, the woman who stood alone. She never argued with it anymore. She had once fought against the myth, resented it, wished to bury it. But as years stretched into decades, she began to understand. The story wasn't really hers anymore. It belonged to others. The cadets who needed it on sleepless nights, the soldiers who clung to it in mud and fire, the voices who whispered it when silence grew too heavy. For them, it wasn't about truth. It wasn't about numbers or reports. It was about believing that courage could outlast fear. And if they needed her name to believe that, she would let them have it. One evening, sitting alone in her quarters, Elena caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her hair, once blonde, was streaked with gray. Her eyes, once sharp, carried shadows but also something softer. Her scars had faded but never disappeared. She studied herself for a long time, as though looking at a stranger. The legend and the woman stared at each other in silence. Finally she whispered, "I was never what they say." But then she added, softer still, "Maybe I didn't need to be." The years dulled the noise. The medals gathered dust. The files yellowed in archives. But in the barracks, in the quiet corners of bases far from that river valley, whispers remained. Remember the bridge. Remember Cross. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It wasn't about history. It was about the moment one soldier refused to fall. And in the end, that was enough. Because some stories don't need to be shouted. Some survive in whispers. How do you say goodbye to a story that never felt like yours to begin with? Elena Cross never tried. She simply lived, one quiet day after another, long after the battle that had defined her in the eyes of everyone else. She carried her scars with a steady grace, the kind that comes not from pride but from acceptance. The bridge, the rain, the roar of the river, those memories stayed sharp, but the edges dulled over time. They no longer cut her the way they once had. They became part of her, like bones under skin. She grew older. Her body slowed, her steps shortened, her hands trembled more than they once had. But her eyes, steel gray, unwavering, remained the same. Eyes that had stared down the impossible and chosen not to move. In the end, it wasn't medals or ceremonies or even the whispers that defined her. It was the quiet. The quiet of evenings when she sat alone with a cup of tea, steam rising like ghosts of breath on cold nights. The quiet of walking past cadets who straightened their backs just a little taller because of her. The quiet of rivers, any river, reminding her of one choice on one night that refused to fade. There were still whispers, even decades later. A group of young recruits around a barracks fire, passing stories like contraband. Did you hear about Cross? They said she held the bridge 7 hours straight. No, it was 12. My uncle swore it. They say she never bled, never stopped. The details shifted, stretched, twisted, but the heart remained, the image of one soldier holding where no one else could. And sometimes, late at night, one of them would whisper softer, "If she could do that, maybe I can do this." Elena never heard those words herself, but if she had, she might have smiled, not because the story was accurate but because it was useful. Sometimes truth matters less than belief. Her visits to the bridge grew fewer as her body weakened, but she returned one last time, years after her cane had become a necessity. The valley was quiet, the sun warm. The stone arches still stood, scarred but solid. The river flowed calm beneath, carrying nothing more than light. She stopped at the center, resting her hand against the weathered parapet. Her fingers traced the bullet holes like old friends. Her breath caught, not from exertion but from memory. She closed her eyes. The storm returned not in reality but in the theater of her mind. Gunfire, screams, Mason's laugh, the detonator in her palm, the hammer swinging down, the roar of rotors. And then the silence that followed. That silence had always been the loudest part. She whispered into the air, voice frail but steady, "You carried them home." The river didn't answer, but it didn't need to. After that visit, she rarely spoke of the bridge again. Not to cadets, not to comrades, not even to herself. It wasn't because she had forgotten. It was because she finally understood. The bridge no longer needed her voice. The story lived without her now. When the end came, it came quietly. No battlefield, no storm, just a bed in a modest room, light filtering through a thin curtain, the sound of a distant rain tapping against the roof. She lay still, her breath shallow, her body frail. Her medals gathered dust in a drawer. Her uniform hung in a closet untouched. Her cane leaned against the wall. But her eyes, still gray, still steady, looked out the window toward a horizon only she could see. Some say her last words were nothing at all, that she simply closed her eyes and let silence carry her. Others claim she whispered something, one more minute, maybe, or Mason's name, or the simple truth she had carried all her life. No record exists, no certainty remains. And maybe that's how she wanted it. In the years after, her story lived on. Cadets at the academy still studied Bridge Point Alpha. Instructors still drew chalk lines on boards. Soldiers still whispered the legend of Cross's Bridge in faraway outposts, their voices low but steady. It didn't matter if the details blurred, if the numbers shifted, if the truth bent with time. What mattered was the shape of the story. A woman who was told to hold the bridge. A woman who stood when everyone else had fallen. A woman who proved that courage doesn't need recognition, it only needs conviction. And so Elena Cross became more than a name. Not because of what she had done, but because of what others believed they could do when they remembered her. Sometimes legends aren't born, they're not chosen, they're not asked for. Sometimes legends are simply the echoes of one stubborn choice, carried forward by those who need it most. And in the end, her story left behind no speeches, no declarations, no final testimony. Only this, that sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.